On one of the lower branches of the giant tree known as Yggdrasil, there nestled a modest cabin. It seemed to have grown straight out of the wood itself, with walls covered in moss and vines, and a roof that disappeared into the thick foliage. Nearby, a small pen held a few dozen sheep, their bleating echoing among the branches, creating a strange, almost otherworldly melody. A carefully tended vegetable patch lay close by, showing signs of attentive hands. Who could have thought that, at such a height, where clouds became neighbors, someone led a simple, earthly life? Any traveler who climbed this high would surely wonder, who lived in this lost corner of the world? The answer was simple but no less mysterious. Here lived a hermit named Elheim, though he preferred to be called Targorn. Rumor had it he was an ancient hero whose fame was lost to the dust of ages. Now he was the only hope against an impending threat, a shadow moving toward one of the kingdom of Ardentia's cities. Richard and his companions cautiously entered the cabin. The floorboards creaked quietly underfoot, and the smell of wood and herbs filled the air. In the dim light of the room, they made out the figure of the host. Richard froze upon seeing Targorn. He was an older man who looked remarkably like him. But it wasn't his appearance that stunned Richard. It was the same golden fire in the hermit's eyes. This was a werewolf, bearing the same curse as himself. Targorn gazed at them with yellow eyes, reflecting the wisdom and experience of many years lived. His voice was low and calm. "What help do uninvited guests seek?" Richard bowed, removed his helmet, revealing his true form to all present. His heart beat faster, but he tried to remain composed. The hermit, upon seeing his face, showed neither surprise nor wariness, as if meeting someone like him was something he had come to expect. "My name is Richard," he said firmly. "We were sent by the priestess of the Order of the Moonlit Night, Lucia." At the mention of the priestess's name, a shadow of memory flickered in Targorn's eyes. He slowly looked them over, as if weighing something in his mind, then nodded. "If you've come this far, you must be weary. Sit down." Richard and his companions exchanged glances, feeling the tension gradually ease. They sat at a massive wooden table, its surface scarred with countless marks, silent witnesses of years gone by. Targorn slowly brewed tea, filling the room with the fragrance of herbs mixed with the scent of burning wood in the hearth. After handing each of them a cup, the hermit took a seat across from them. Steam rose from the hot drink, swirling into curious patterns. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the faint sound of wind moving among the branches. "Tell me your story," Targorn said, crossing his arms on the table. His gaze was sharp and penetrating, as if he could peer into the very soul. Richard took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, but knew that much depended on his words now. Richard began his story, carefully choosing his words. He mentioned that due to betrayal, an ancient seal had been broken, and a demon named Erixar, imprisoned for centuries, had broken free. Now he was approaching the city of Kaltar, and by estimates, they had only 3 weeks before the creature reached its goal. Targorn listened silently, nodding occasionally. When Richard fell silent, the werewolf exhaled wearily and muttered under his breath, "That girl thinks I'll come at her first call." Richard flinched in surprise. Targorn spoke of Lucia, the priestess of the Moon Order, as if she were someone familiar, even close. And he spoke of her as if she were much younger. How old could he possibly be? Suddenly, Targorn raised his gaze and asked, "What about the matriarch?" Richard averted his eyes, falling silent. After a moment, he replied sadly, "We don't know. She stayed in the temple when we left. Whether she's alive is uncertain." The old wolf smirked, looking at Richard with a challenging glint in his eyes. "That old woman is not so easily killed." Then Targorn sank into deep thought, his gaze distant. Finally, he lifted his cup and drained the tea in one gulp, sighing with a hint of regret. "I cannot come and help you," he said. Surprised by his refusal, Richard exchanged glances with his companions. Fear and despair flashed in his eyes, as if he momentarily realized the enormity of the threat before them. Understanding that they could not defeat the demon on their own, he asked resolutely, "But why? We can't abandon the city to its fate. Aren't you the ancient hero who once fought against evil?" Targorn suddenly laughed, his yellow eyes glinting with a strange amusement. Baring his sharp teeth, he cast a sharp look at Richard and replied, "Humans." His voice was bitter. "They are the most ungrateful creatures imaginable. I can see in your eyes that you know this. And here you are, asking me to save them. Why should I?" The werewolf's words were filled with cynicism and disdain, but Richard sensed something else, a hidden feeling betrayed by subtle notes in his tone. He felt that beneath the mask of indifference and resentment lay a genuine concern for people, those who needed his help. "Are you sure you can't help us?" Richard asked once more, trying to ignite a spark of his former heroic courage within Targorn. The old wolf frowned and replied firmly, "No, I cannot leave this place." Disappointed, they rose from their seats, preparing to leave. They faced a long journey back, and any hope of aid seemed lost. But just as they were about to take a step, Targorn raised a hand, stopping them. "Wait," he said, narrowing his eyes. "I said I wouldn't go with you. I didn't say I wouldn't help." Richard, already poised to leave, paused, raising his eyebrows in surprise. "What does that mean?" Targorn looked over his companions, his gaze settling on Finn and his uncle Myron. "You two are from the nearby tribe, correct?" he asked. Finn and Myron nodded, exchanging wary glances. "Excellent," continued the old werewolf. "Then you can go. Climb down and return to your own," he said, then looked at Richard and Lance. "And you two will come with me. I have something to show you." This took everyone by surprise, but Richard nodded, understanding that they had few options left. They bid farewell to Finn and Myron, who reluctantly left them on the branch of Yggdrasil and began their descent. Soon, their silhouettes faded among the leaves. Targorn was in no hurry. His movements were slow but sure. First, he gathered several small bundles from a cabinet, carefully placing them into cloth bags. Then he stepped outside and tended to his animals and plants. He tossed a generous handful of hay to the sheep, filled a wooden trough with water, and even poured several scoops over the vegetable patches, carefully drawing water from a large barrel. Finally, he returned to the house and emerged a moment later, holding an old sword with a worn hilt, which he deftly strapped to his belt. Targorn then approached a large bell by the door and struck it several times, the sound echoing loudly among the branches. Richard watched in confusion, wondering what would happen next. Suddenly, he felt a gentle vibration coursing through the branch beneath him, growing stronger with each passing moment. Out of the shadows below the massive branch, a creature emerged, bringing Richard to stunned silence. It was an enormous lizard, majestic and intimidating, with scales of faded emerald green. Its massive body moved with a heaviness that caused the wood beneath it to reverberate, sending vibrations all around. The lizard's back was adorned with large ridges, which resembled natural saddles, perfect for riding. With surprising agility, the old werewolf climbed onto the creature's back, settling into one of the ridges. He turned to Richard and Lance, nodding for them to follow. Climbing onto the giant lizard was no easy task. Its scales were slick beneath their hands, and its body trembled with each movement. But after some effort, they managed to settle behind Targorn. "Hold on tight," Targorn warned. "It's a long way." He leaned forward and murmured a few words in a language Richard didn't know. The lizard responded with a low, growling sound, then suddenly surged forward, moving along the branch as if gliding. Its legs navigated the bark deftly and silently, and despite its size, it gracefully overcame every bump and turn. The wind whistled in Richard's ears, and he clutched the wooden ridges on the lizard's back even tighter. After a while, they reached the canopy, and the lizard began climbing upward, gripping uneven surfaces and ledges with its clawed feet. Time seemed to lose all meaning, and as Richard watched the giant creature move ever higher, he felt small and insignificant in this world, where trees reached the sky and forests stretched to the horizon. Hours passed, and at last, twilight began to fall. In the thickening dusk, the giant tree cast shadows, transforming everything around them into a mysterious maze of branches and leaves. Richard felt exhaustion setting in. His body grew heavy from the journey, and his fingers were numb from gripping the ridges on the lizard's back. Lance, sitting beside him, looked equally worn out. "Let's stop here," Targorn said, halting the lizard on one of the massive branches as wide as a city street. They dismounted and quickly began preparing for the night. Richard looked around. Above them, the starry sky peeked through the dense canopy, and a profound silence filled the air. His thoughts were jumbled and filled with worry. He knew that trials awaited them, but now, under the vast stars, in the company of an ancient hero and a strange creature, his heart held a curious blend of fear and peace. Sitting by the fire, Richard watched Targorn intently, the soft glow of the flames illuminating his face. Taking care not to break the silence, he carefully asked a question that had troubled him many times. "Have you ever tried to rid yourself of this curse?" Targorn froze for a moment before letting out a bitter smile that held the weight of his long life. "You chose the right word, boy," he said. "They call us chosen, talk of it as some sort of gift. But let's be honest, it really is a curse. I tried to be free of it too, but as you can see, I'm still here, still a monster." He fell silent for a moment, his gaze sinking into the fire as if he saw memories known only to him. Finally, Targorn lifted his eyes and asked, "How did you get your power?" Richard took a deep breath and began his story. He recalled the day he encountered a dying she-wolf and a giant snake. After that meeting, his life changed forever. He received the curse that became his burden. Targorn nodded, as though remembering something distant. Mother of wolves. Yes, the last time I saw her, she was already on her last breath, he said. That must have been, 200 years ago. I suppose she's weakened for good since then. Richard noticed the shadow darken Targorn's face, and realized he held no fondness for the mother of wolves. The werewolf sat across from him, staring into the fire, and then began his story, as if it were not memories, but part of an old, forgotten legend. It was about 1,000 years ago, he began quietly. I was just a simple farmer then. I lived a modest but happy life, working in the fields, sharing evenings with my wife and child. Everything I needed, I achieved with my own hands. But one day, while out in the forest, I encountered something that changed my life forever. Targorn paused, as though reliving the pain of that day. A monster attacked me, a creature from the darkest nightmares. I couldn't fight it off. It nearly tore me apart, and I was ready to die. But then she appeared, a giant she-wolf. She saved my life, driving off the creature, but left her mark on me. I think I would have preferred to die back then. He ran his hand over the scars on his wrist, as if feeling the pain of the wounds once more. Gazing into the fire, Targorn continued. When I awoke, neither the she-wolf nor the monster was there. Miraculously, my wounds had healed, but my hands, they weren't the same, and my body had changed. I ran to a stream to look at my reflection, and there, yellow beastly eyes stared back at me. I howled in despair, knowing I couldn't return to my family like this. But without me, they would have starved. Targorn fell silent for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. That evening, I went home. My wife fainted at the sight of me, but our little one seemed to recognize his father and was happy. When my wife came to, I told her everything. She accepted me as best she could, but there was always a hint of distance in her eyes. After a time, the villagers started to suspect something. They saw me and ran in fear, but I ignored them. I was with my family. He frowned, and Richard noticed Targorn's fists clenched tightly. One day, I went into the woods to find that she-wolf, to demand she return my form. When I came back, my house was ablaze. My wife and son, his voice broke. The villagers killed them. They destroyed everything I loved, leaving me with only pain and emptiness. Richard clenched his fists, sharing in the pain that connected him to this ancient hero. I was blinded by rage, Targorn whispered, lowering his head. When I came to my senses, the village was gone, its inhabitants dead. I don't even remember how it happened. It wasn't me. It was the monster they had made me. After that, I left, determined to find that she-wolf and kill her. But she vanished. The pain slowly faded and I kept moving. His face grew calm, and a longing for a time long past flickered in his eyes. In the end, I met her, the moon goddess. She healed my heart, closing the wounds, and since then I've served her. I've endured countless battles and catastrophes, and now here I am, 1,000 years later. He fell silent, and the fire continued to crackle softly, filling the quiet of the night. After finishing his story, Targorn's gaze, weary and thoughtful, lingered on Richard. He looked him up and down, and the corners of his mouth twitched in a faint, knowing smile. "You know," Targorn said, "the armor you wear and that sword, they once belonged to me. It seems that old woman passed them on to you." Richard raised his brows in surprise, realizing their connection ran even deeper than he had thought. "Yes," he confirmed. "The armor did come from the matriarch, and the sword, it was given to me by a dragon." He paused for a moment as if pondering something, then reached into his bag. Taking out a blue crystal skull, he carefully placed it before him on the ground. Seeing the skull, Targorn frowned, and a shadow of the past flickered in his eyes. "So that's where it was," he murmured quietly, staring at the relic. "This thing. What is it?" Richard asked, feeling a strange unease as the werewolf reacted to the ancient artifact. Targorn spoke slowly, as though choosing his words carefully to convey the importance of what he was about to say. "That is the skull of the wolf progenitor, an ancient relic that came with the mother of wolves from another realm." His voice lowered, as if the very air around them grew thick with mystery. "You know, our regeneration is remarkable. Even if only a fragment of you remains, you can fully heal. Yes, and we live long, though not forever." He sighed, running his hand over his old scars, each one a testament to his centuries-long life. "However," he continued, "our power is only partially unlocked at the beginning. This skull is the key, capable of lifting that barrier and granting you knowledge of past eras. By using it, you'll gain immense power, but it won't come without a price." Richard listened intently, his thoughts growing increasingly unsettled. "That sword you carry," Targorn went on, "it can restore your human form. You'd be able to become a wolf at will, retaining immense strength. But if you decide to use the skull and fully unlock your power, the sword will lose its magic, and you will remain in beast form forever. You see, I made that choice once, and though I loathe it, I couldn't turn away." Targorn leaned forward, his eyes meeting Richard's. There was a depth of wisdom in his gaze, the kind held by those who had endured more than a single soul could bear. "Guard this skull," he said softly. "One day, a moment of choice will come. You will decide whether to be a man or remain a wolf. The decision is yours." Richard listened in silence, his heart pounding, thoughts swirling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he felt elated at the possibility of reclaiming his human form. But on the other, he was troubled by the prospect that fate might force him to use the skull, abandoning his humanity forever. The desire to be human again was his deepest yearning, yet now he understood the weight that lay upon his shoulders. And all he could do was gaze at the ancient relic, its surface reflecting the flickering firelight, a constant reminder of the choice he would one day have to make. While Richard was lost in his thoughts, Targorn turned his gaze to Lance and spoke. "You are a descendant of the Adels, aren't you? Are any of your kin still alive?" Lance shook his head sadly, a look of sorrow crossing his face. "As far as I know, I am the last of the Adels, although I still hope that somewhere in this world, others of my blood might remain." The old werewolf sighed deeply and shook his head slightly. "The Adels, an ancient and powerful people," he said, gazing thoughtfully into the fire. "In the old wars, they played a significant role in saving this land. But the irony is that their sacrifice seems to have been in vain. Now, their legacy is reduced to you, the last of your line." Targorn sighed again and continued, "That is fate. People don't even understand the extent to which your people influence their lives and the salvation of this world. Instead, they call you vampires, all because of your longevity. They think you drink blood, when in reality you merely feed on the energy emanated by living beings, especially those like me. No wonder you've become so attached to this young man, right?" Lance only gave a mysterious smile, one that didn't escape Richard's watchful eye. Richard glanced at him, still not fully understanding the situation, and suddenly realized this explained the bond between them, though perhaps it was far more complex than he imagined. Ignoring Richard's expression, Targorn continued, "Long ago, your ancestor once followed me, feeding off my energy. Over time, we became like brothers, but unfortunately, he perished defending me." The old wolf tossed more wood into the fire as if trying to hide his sorrow. "That spear you carry," he said. "Let me take a closer look at it." Without hesitation, Lance handed over the spear, and the old werewolf took it in his hands, examining each curve of the ancient weapon. His expression grew pensive, and finally he spoke. "I know who it belonged to. In the past, there was a legendary spearman who could shatter mountains with his spear. His name was Thorvin Thunderstrike." Lance looked at the spear in awe, realizing whose hands this artifact had once been in. "Where did you find it?" Targorn asked, not taking his eyes off the spear. Lance nodded briefly, recalling the day he discovered the tomb containing this artifact. "I found it in an old tomb, full of traps. Every detail was carefully guarded, and this spear lay at its center." "Impressive," Targorn said thoughtfully, handing the spear back to Lance. "Keep it safe. It holds immense power that not everyone can unlock." Lance nodded, feeling the weight of Targorn's words, and carefully took the spear back, seeing it now in a new light. Meanwhile, Targorn looked over his companions, noting their weariness, and said, "We need to rest. Get some sleep. We'll rise early tomorrow." They settled in for the night by the fire, their shadows dancing across the branches under the light of distant stars. At dawn, they awoke with the first rays of sunlight. The sky blushed with gentle shades of pink and gold as the mist still cloaked the treetops. After breakfast, they mounted the back of the giant lizard once more, which gracefully resumed its path through the vast canopy of Yggdrasil, moving smoothly among the countless branches woven by nature itself. After some time, the lizard stopped at one branch that at first glance appeared ordinary, but upon closer inspection, they noticed a narrow crevice hidden beneath a piece of bark. Targorn deftly slid the bark aside, revealing a passage. He slipped inside and gestured for the others to follow. Crawling through the narrow entry, they found themselves in a vast hall hidden within the heart of the tree. The air was thick with dampness, wood dust, and an ancient magical scent, as though time itself had stilled here. Before them was what looked like a temple, carved from the living wood. Columns lined the walls, appearing as if they held up the temple's vaulted ceiling. A dim light seeped through thin cracks in the walls, casting an extraordinary play of shadow and light in the space, adding a mystical, almost otherworldly aura. Ancient vessels and objects covered in the dust of ages rested on stone ledges. In the center of the hall stood a statue of a man, majestic and powerful, frozen in a stance of noble strength. His face was solemn, and his hands gripped a spear pointing downward. Lance, holding his breath, moved closer, feeling an invisible connection to this place. "These things belong to your ancestors," Targorn said, addressing Lance. "My old friend, your ancestor, left all this and asked me to pass it on to his descendants if they ever found themselves in need." Targorn sighed. "But now, only you remain, and now you may uncover the secrets of your lineage. The Adels were great sorcerers. I hope you discover something new and gain the strength to help you on your journey." Lance, filled with the gravity of the moment, bowed before the statue and, in a low voice, thanked Targorn. His eyes gleamed with resolve and quiet confidence. He knew this was one of the most important moments of his life. Sitting down before the statue, Lance crossed his legs and closed his eyes, immersing himself in meditation, striving to feel and absorb the power left behind by his ancestors. Targorn and Richard, casting a final glance at Lance, quietly left the temple, leaving him alone with the secrets preserved within the walls of this ancient sanctuary. They knew that when Lance emerged, he would no longer be the same man. They continued to ascend through the endless labyrinth of Yggdrasil's branches. The tree's limbs stretched upward, seeming to reach the very vault of the heavens, as if the boundaries of this tree didn't exist, and it spread out, engulfing everything around. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and occasionally, sunlight pierced through the canopy, illuminating the path of their unusual company. And then, Richard noticed something that made him stop, holding his breath. Ahead, among the entwined branches, stood something incredible. A colossal sword, awe-inspiring in its majesty and power. Its blade was deeply embedded in the tree's thickness, as if someone of almost incomprehensible strength and size had once driven it into the wood. The sword was so gigantic it could rival the towers of castles, and even the largest branches sprawling around it seemed like thin threads compared to this colossus. Richard couldn't help but wonder. To what kind of warrior could such a weapon have belonged? How tall and powerful would one have to be to wield it? He couldn't even imagine where this sword had come from, or how ancient its owner must have been. Their path along the branches drew them ever closer to this gigantic blade, and Richard felt a growing sense of awe mingled with curiosity. Finally, they reached the place where the blade was embedded in the wood. Its width was so vast that many castles could fit across it. The surface of the blade bore the marks of time, rust, cracks, and darkened steel, yet it still held a power that seemed capable of cleaving mountains. As Richard approached, he noticed that the sword's surface was covered in soil and rocks, from which real mountains and ravines had formed. Everything around looked as if this wasn't merely the surface of a sword, but a small world hidden within an ancient artifact. Majestic mountain ranges and narrow canyons stretched into the distance, disappearing beyond his view. It was a breathtaking sight, one that made him feel the insignificance and fragility of human life in the face of ancient and mighty forces. Targorn dismounted from his lizard, and Richard followed, still stunned by this incredible place. The old werewolf glanced around, as if assessing their surroundings, then turned to Richard and said, "At last, we have arrived. Here, I will teach you to wield your power." Richard glanced at the sword, his voice filled with reverence and wonder as he asked, "What is this place? How did this sword come to be here?" Targorn squinted, casting a grim look at the colossal blade as if recalling distant memories. "Yggdrasil is not merely a tree," he began. "It's a connection, an unbreakable thread linking worlds. It exists in all times and dimensions simultaneously. They say anyone who steps onto its branches stands outside time and space. This sword is just one of the many relics that ended up here from other worlds." Richard listened, stunned by the revelation. Targorn continued, his voice heavy and somber, as if he were speaking of ancient truths known only to a few. "To breach our world, dark forces from other dimensions must enslave this tree. A great battle unfolded here in the past, and perhaps you've seen its traces as you made your way here. This sword came from another dimension. It carries a curse, one that afflicts the tree itself. Its purpose is to open a tear in space, allowing creatures from other worlds to invade and enslave our world." Targorn paused, glancing back at the ancient blade, which emitted a cold, malevolent glow, shrouded in darkness and curse. Richard felt an invisible force radiating from the sword, like a poisonous energy that sent chills down his spine. This power seemed to spawn creatures, monsters like parasites, that attacked Yggdrasil, consuming it from within. "These creatures are like parasites," Targorn continued. "They feed on the tree's life energy, and it's my task to destroy them to preserve Yggdrasil and our world. But at the same time, we learn from our enemies. The masters of our world, seeing this sword, created their own legendary weapons, much like the blade you carry at your side. But you have yet to awaken its true power and unlock your own." "Tell me about the magic you wield," Targorn requested. Richard nodded and explained that he possessed lunar magic and a curse-bound magic, which bore dark red hues as if infused with blood. Hearing this, Targorn frowned, folding his arms across his chest as he sighed. "Wolves are indeed bound to the moon, and we can wield its magic, but it is the power of a local deity who is no more." His words landed like a thunderclap. "The moon goddess Lunael? Does that mean she's dead?" Richard barely managed to speak, feeling a pang of sorrow within. Targorn slowly nodded, his gaze dimming. Her material body was destroyed and her consciousness scattered like mist. Yet her power still enshrouds this world, shining with the moon. This fate befell many gods. Only a few managed to survive and hide. Among them is Sharak, trapped in an adjacent dimension. Those who pray to the gods believe they will be heard, but they only borrow residual power. It is confined to this dimension and incapable of true magic. Targorn looked back at Richard. And the red magic you use, that's the magic from the world from which our curse originates. It's wild and fierce. Using it can be dangerous to both you and those around you. You must master the magic of true power that does no harm. The old werewolf raised his hand, and blue flames ignited in his palm. The fire glowed coldly yet brightly, emanating a calm yet boundless strength. The flame was so mesmerizing and imposing that Richard couldn't look away. "This is the magic of the Druids," Targorn said, his voice solemn. "You must also learn it. The armor you wear and the weapon you hold will help. You've probably noticed the blue magical stones embedded in them. These stones enhance the effect of druidic magic, making you much stronger." Richard ran his hand over his armor and sword, and indeed his gaze lingered on the small blue stones set into the armor and the hilt of his sword. They had always been with him, but now he understood that their purpose was not only for protection, but also to amplify his strength. "Your first task is to conquer this sword," Targorn continued, nodding toward the giant blade towering above them. "But to do that, you need to learn about its creation and forge a connection with it. Sit and lay your sword on your lap," he instructed. "Close your eyes and focus. Channel your energy into the blade. Feel the ancient power and wisdom flowing into you. It will reveal what has been lost for centuries." Richard obediently sat at the base of the giant sword, his heart racing. He laid his blade on his lap and closed his eyes. Feeling his breath, he began directing his energy inward toward his weapon. Silence surrounded him, with only a faint glimmer of light filtering through the branches, and the ancient magic of the tree enveloping him, as if welcoming him into its embrace. Suddenly, Richard felt something pulling at his mind, drawing him into the depths of the unknown, and within a moment he found himself in the middle of a strange city, standing on a dusty street. Ancient stone houses stretched around him, and the streets bustled with activity. Beside him stood a man in his 40s, with a beard and sharp features that felt oddly familiar. They looked at each other in surprise, as if neither understood how they had ended up there. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice raspy but strong. Richard glanced around and was astonished to realize he was in human form again. He raised his hands, touching his face, and felt smooth skin with no trace of the curse. The man across from him also touched his own hands in surprise, a slight confusion in his gaze. Yet, there was something eerily familiar about him. Suddenly, their attention was drawn by a noise. A teenager, about 15 years old, with long black hair and a simple appearance, ran down the street. He stopped before them, catching his breath, and looked at them pleadingly. "Guys, tell the guards I ran to the right." Without waiting for an answer, the boy turned and ran to the left. Moments later, a group of guards rounded the corner, running up to them. "Did you see a boy running away? Which way did he go?" Richard was about to answer, but the man beside him spoke first. "He went to the right." The guards thanked them and ran off in the indicated direction. Richard cast a glance at his companion, who looked back with a hint of pride, as if testing his mettle. When the guards disappeared, the boy peeked cautiously from around the corner, quickly surveying the scene before approaching them. "I'm really grateful to you," he said with a wide smile. "My name is Elric. What are your names?" Richard froze at the name. Elric, the same name as his enchanted sword. Could it be a coincidence? But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the very person destined to become that legendary weapon. "My name is Richard," he said, nodding to the boy. His companion gave a curt introduction. "I'm Targorn." Richard glanced again in surprise at the man. The name Targorn was no accident either. Was this the same ancient werewolf he traveled with? How was all this connected, and why didn't they recognize each other? Thoughts swirled in Richard's mind, but Elric interrupted him. "For helping me, I'd like to invite you over. I'll treat you to what I can. What do you say?" Richard nodded, and Targorn did as well, though he looked distinctly displeased at the idea of going with them. They followed Elric, who confidently led them through narrow streets, weaving through winding alleyways. Eventually, they reached a poor neighborhood, where the houses were worn and dilapidated, windows boarded up, and the streets thick with grime underfoot. They approached one of the old houses, and Elric pushed open its creaky door with ease. Inside, the poverty was evident, but everything was clean and orderly. In the corner lay an elderly woman with a pale face and trembling hands. She appeared weak and ill, but her eyes lit up softly when she saw Elric and his guests. "Mom, these are my new friends," Elric said with joy in his voice, addressing her. "They helped me." The woman managed a faint smile, giving a small nod before leaning back against her pillow. "We live as best we can," Elric explained, seating his guests and pulling back a curtain to let some light into the room. "My mother is sick, and I do everything I can to find money for her treatment. Thank you for helping me." He smiled, his eyes bright with gratitude. The conversation gradually turned to life, to the struggles each of them had faced. Elric, despite his young age, was full of determination and found new ways to survive and care for his family every day. His sincerity and bravery made an impression on Richard, and he felt a deep fondness for this boy. "You're good people," Elric said after a long conversation, his gaze serious. "What do you think about being friends?" "Of course," Targorn replied with an odd note in his voice. He shot Richard a dark look as though displeased with his presence. Richard, sensing the tension, didn't let it faze him. He gave Elric a warm smile and replied firmly, "Of course we can be friends." Elric beamed, and the elderly woman quietly watched them, as if approving of the new alliance. The world spun around Richard once more, and in the next instant, he found himself in a vast cavern where a fierce battle was raging. He held a sword in his hands, feeling its weight and the confidence it gave him. Beside him stood Targorn, who looked around with equal surprise. Seeing Richard, his gaze darkened, and he asked irritably, "You again? Who are you?" Richard didn't have time to answer, as a skeleton wielding a sword attacked him, but he managed to parry the blow and threw himself into the fight, battling the enemies surrounding them on all sides. They seemed endless, skeletal warriors, revived by black magic, lunged at Richard and his companions one after another. After a tense struggle, when the last skeleton collapsed to the ground, they were able to catch their breath. In addition to Richard and Targorn, Elric was there, along with several others who waved their arms in celebration of their victory. Elric ran up to Richard, his eyes shining with admiration. "You were incredible. Where did you learn to fight like that?" Richard simply smiled, not wanting to go into explanations. They continued deeper into the cavern. As they walked, Richard tried to understand what was happening to him. It seemed as though he had fallen into the past or into some kind of memory. Elric accepted their presence as if they had known each other for a long time. Richard couldn't make sense of it, but decided to observe and follow along. Soon they reached the end of the cavern, where a green glowing stone sat on a pedestal, emitting a mysterious radiance. Elric rushed over, grabbed the stone and tucked it into his bag, saying with satisfaction, "Finally, we found it. Now we must return quickly." They left the cave and the world spun again. In the next moment, Richard found himself outside Elric's home. The young man ran inside, but soon a scream rang out. Richard rushed in after him and was met with a sorrowful scene. On the bed lay an old woman, Elric's mother, and beside her sat a woman whose face was shadowed by sorrow. They hadn't been able to save her. Elric, now around 20 years old, knelt beside his mother's lifeless body, holding her close and quietly crying. The stone he had brought slipped from his hand and rolled across the floor, symbolizing the futility of his efforts. Richard approached Elric, placing a hand on his shoulder, and said, "Stay strong, my friend. We'll always be here for you." Targorn also stepped forward, joining in the condolences. Elric looked up at them, his eyes filled with tears, and quietly replied, "Thank you. You have no idea how much this means to me." Richard felt a growing respect and affection for this young man. But at that moment, the world spun again, and they found themselves surrounded by a large crowd of people. The atmosphere was filled with joy and laughter. Beside Richard stood Elric, dressed in robes he recognized. Elric embraced him and Targorn, saying, "Guys, I got accepted into the Magic Academy." Richard, unable to hide his happiness, congratulated him, praising his achievement. Targorn congratulated him as well, and Richard felt this moment was significant for their friendship. However, their joy was short-lived. They were transported again, and Richard found himself in the middle of a city engulfed in fire and chaos. Screams echoed from all sides, and a massive monster was destroying buildings, crushing everything in its path. Richard held his sword, and someone nearby shouted his name. He turned to see an older Elric, now a skilled mage, dressed in rich robes and casting powerful fire spells at the monster. Realizing he needed to act, Richard and Targorn rushed into battle. They fought, combining their strengths with Elric's precise spellcasting, covering the creature in flames. Together they managed to defeat the monster, which fell to the ground, leaving only ashes and ruins in its wake. "You arrived just in time," Elric said, breathing heavily. "I wouldn't have managed alone." Richard patted him on the shoulder, smiling. "What would you do without us, my friend?" Looking around, Richard tried to make sense of it all. It seemed they were at the heart of a war. The streets were filled with people running, and traces of battle were everywhere. But before he could process it, the world spun around him once more, preparing him for the next challenge. They found themselves in the midst of a terrifying battlefield, where humans fought against a horde of monstrous creatures. Cries of horror and the clash of steel filled the air. But among the monsters, one stood out, towering above the fortress walls, emanating a menacing aura. Its massive body was covered in spikes and thick armor-like skin. Its eyes glowed a fierce red, and its mouth was filled with jagged, dagger-like teeth. With every step, this creature swept everything aside, smashing limbs onto people, destroying catapults, and crushing ranks of mere dust. Upon seeing this monster, many soldiers succumbed to panic, dropping their weapons and fleeing in desperate attempts to survive. Richard noticed that Elric was standing still amidst the chaos, mesmerized by the sight of the giant creature. Richard grabbed him by the shoulder, forcefully pulling him back. "Elric, we need to get out of here." They ran from the battlefield, leaving behind the screams and the frenzied darkness spreading across the land. When they finally stopped, Elric walked with his head lowered, his face contorted with pain and despair. "We have to find a way to defeat that creature," he murmured, clenching his fists. Beside them walked a woman dressed in the robes of the Order of the Moon's Night. Her eyes shone with wisdom, and her voice sounded calming despite the chaos they had just left behind. "I know someone who can help," she said softly but confidently. Elric's head shot up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Who is it?" But before the woman could answer, Richard felt everything around him begin to spin, pulling him into another place. A moment later, he found himself in a clearing deep within a dense forest. In front of him stood a massive she-wolf, her eyes radiating the wisdom of ages. Richard recognized her instantly. It was the mother of wolves. She appeared majestic, commanding both fear and respect. Standing beside Richard were Elric, Targorn, and the priestess of the Order of the Moon's Night, while the entire clearing was cloaked in a strange, barely perceptible magic. Targorn bared his teeth at the sight of the wolf, clearly not having forgiven her. Elric took a step forward, bowing as he spoke, his voice full of determination. "Mother of wolves, humanity is in danger. Please, help us face this threat." A moment of silence hung in the air. Then the Mother of Wolves' grand voice resonated in their minds, soft yet powerful, filling everything around them. "I can help you, but I require a sacrifice," she said. Elric, trembling, asked, "What kind of sacrifice?" In response, a blue stone appeared before them, radiating a bright azure glow that enveloped everything around. The stone seemed imbued with ancient, primal magic, and its light made everything in the clearing nearly transparent, as if space itself bowed to its power. "This stone is an artifact from my world," the Mother of Wolves continued. "It possesses immense energy, but to wield it, it requires a soul to channel its power." The Mother of Wolves continued, her voice calm yet commanding. "This energy is called druidic magic. The source of this power is a channel connecting worlds, passing through a single tree. Druidic magic draws its strength from all dimensions, from every existing reality, and it is boundless. My race once learned to wield this ability, for they lived within this ancient tree and became part of it. To use this power, you must feel every part of your flesh becoming a bridge between worlds, absorbing energy from every corner of the universe." Richard felt the Mother of Wolves' words seep into his soul, as if they were meant for him alone. He glanced at Targorn, who, despite his irritation and clear reluctance, listened intently. It was evident that the Mother of Wolves was aware of their presence here, and knew that her words could guide their path. The she-wolf turned her gaze to Elric and continued, "Once the soul is sealed within this stone, it must be embedded in a sword and given to the hero capable of wielding its power." Then she looked at each of them and posed a grim question. "Who is willing to make the sacrifice?" Silence fell over the clearing. Elric lowered his head, clenching his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He stared at the ground for a long time before slowly lifting his gaze to the sky. A light breeze swept across the clearing, and the birds flying overhead seemed to bid him farewell. Elric took a deep breath, as if making a final decision, and stepped forward. Richard looked at him, his heart heavy with sorrow. He didn't want this young man, who had endured so many trials and sacrificed everything for his mother, to end his life here. But Elric stepped closer to him and Targorn, embracing them both. Tears glistened on his face, rolling down his cheeks. "Thank you for being by my side all this time," he said, looking at his friends. "But my journey doesn't end here. I believe we'll meet again someday." Richard felt tears welling in his own eyes. Elric pulled away and approached the stone, which shone even brighter, as if acknowledging his decision. He extended his hands and touched the blue stone. At that moment, his body began to dissolve slowly, transforming into light and disappearing in bright blue flashes. He looked at them with sadness, but his gaze held no fear or pain, only infinite peace. Richard felt his heart break with the pain and injustice of watching his friend vanish. He realized how cruel this world could be, but he also understood that it was people like Elric, this small handful of brave souls, who were the true heroes holding the universe together. When Elric's body had fully disappeared, the stone shone even brighter, and the priestess of the Order of the Moon's Night approached, holding a sword. The stone gently descended and fused with the blade, as if filling the weapon with a power ready to awaken. The Mother of Wolves looked at Richard and Targorn, her gaze filled with regret. "Forgive me," she said. "I know this was not your choice, but it was your destiny. I hope you will not hate me forever." Richard felt dizzy, and the world spun around him once more. In the next moment, he awoke, sitting on the massive iron sword that stood high in Yggdrasil's crown. Beside him was a huge man with a wolf's head, his eyes blazing with unyielding strength and wisdom. In Richard's hands was the sword, the blue stone now embedded within it, gleaming. As he rose to his feet, he heard a familiar voice emanating from the sword, warm and full of friendship. "You're back, my friend. I've waited a long time for you." Richard gripped the hilt, his voice steady and determined as he replied, "Of course, my friend. It's time for us to repay our debt to this world." But before Elric could respond, the colossal sword beneath them began to vibrate. The tremors intensified, transferring to the tree, and Richard barely kept his balance. The ground beneath him shuddered, as Yggdrasil seemed to come alive under the assault of something dark and malevolent. When the vibrations finally ceased, Richard looked around and froze, gripped by cold dread. From all the cracks, cliffs, and chasms surrounding them, armies of monsters began to emerge. There were fanged lizards, demonic serpent-like creatures, and even several giants clad in ancient rusted armor. They moved toward them in a dense mass, their roars and moans filling the air. "What's happening?" he asked, turning to Targorn. Targorn frowned, his wolfish gaze tense and filled with alarm. "I don't know, but it's certainly not a good sign." Richard turned back and saw a figure beginning to take shape in the air before them. It hovered above the ground, defying gravity, cloaked in darkness. It was a man in a robe, holding a book, with curly hair and glasses, through which wicked, mocking eyes gleamed. He looked at Richard with a smirk, as if his appearance were part of a carefully planned trap. "Hello there," the stranger said, his voice dripping with sarcasm and disdain. "Long time no see." Richard clenched his teeth, his face hardening with anger. The name slipped from his lips like a curse. "Jenner,"